Welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. Today we're going to be looking at the top running backs for week 2. Obviously, week 1 was a little bit interesting from a fantasy football perspective, so hopefully week 2 we get right back on track with some of the studs living up to their potential. So starting off at number 1, got Saquon Barkley. So he was last week's RB1 by a wide margin, scoring 3 touchdowns in the Brazil game. I know a lot of us were excited to see the debut of Saquon Barkley, how he would perform running behind the best offensive line of his career, and he did not disappoint. So very excited about Saquon heading into week 2. Eagles have one of the highest expected point totals this week facing off against the Falcons. I would expect them to be in a positive game script, and I think it's wheels up for Saquon in week 2. Number 2, Breece Hall. So he had a decent week 1, finishing as the RB14 in a tough matchup against the 49ers. He's got a pretty tough matchup in week 2 against Tennessee. They've got 2 stud defensive tackles in Jeffrey Simmons and rookie Devondre Sweat out of Texas, who looked very good in his debut. But the biggest difference in this game is Tennessee is not going to control the time of possession like San Francisco did. We've seen over the years how once San Francisco gets up, they just run the ball, and it seems like they have it for like 8 minutes at a time. So I would not expect Tennessee to be moving the ball against the New York Jets defense the way that San Francisco did. So would expect Breece to get fed quite a bit because we did see in week 1 that this is a very concentrated offense. Moving over to number 3, Bijan Robinson. He had a pretty solid week 1 against a tough Steelers D. Rushed for 68 yards. He caught 5 passes for 43 yards. Unfortunately, no touchdowns. But he's got another tough matchup against the Eagles this week. And, I talked about this in the quarterback ranking episode where I do have some concerns about Kirk Cousins at this point. The offense did not look good. He did not look healthy. It was not creative. They were not moving the ball very well. So I think with this ranking, it's a volume and talent play with Bijan. So hopefully he can get into the end zone this week because we know with his volume, I think that would lead to a very solid week. Moving over to number 4, Jonathan Taylor. So not the best week 1, only rushing for 48 yards, but he did manage to score a touchdown, which kind of salvaged his week. This week he gets the Packers, who were just torched by Saquon Barkley. I don't expect the Packers offense to be on the field a whole lot, assuming Malik Willis is their starting quarterback. I think it's just so unfortunate for Packers fans that Malik Willis is their only backup QB and their best option at this point. So hopefully Love can come back. But with Taylor, I would expect them to grind out the clock quite a bit. We know Anthony Richardson's going to take some deep shots. We know, he's going to run himself quite a bit. But I think if this offense is moving along really nicely, they're going to continue to feature Taylor, who has zero competition for touches in terms of other running backs on the team. Number 5, Jahmyr Gibbs. So the Lions have the highest expected point total this week in a great matchup against the Bucs. They could be in a positive game script that allows them to run the ball more. I think the encouraging thing with Gibbs, we all know how electric he is when he has the ball in his hands. And we know Montgomery grinded it out in OT. But Montgomery and Gibbs actually split the red zone work almost evenly, which is a very positive thing for Gibbs owners moving forward. We saw last year how, Monty was kind of that goal line guy. But if Gibbs is going to be getting half of those, red zone touches, I think it's going to be wheels up the rest of the season. Number 6, Derrick Henry. A negative game script in week 1 kind of limited his usage and overall upside. We saw him get out-snapped by his running mate, but I don't expect this game or a lot of games where Baltimore will be trailing. This week they've got the Raiders. Ravens are a 2-score favorite, and we saw what J.K. Dobbins did against the Raiders last week. Lamar's not going to run around as much as he did in week 1. That game was more or less like a playoff style game, which is why they let him kind of run loose quite a bit. I know he was pretty banged up and sore earlier this week, so I would expect them to feed Henry quite a bit more and get him going on the ground. Number 7, Kyren Williams. So he showed in week 1 that he's the true workhorse running back, playing 92% of the snaps. One of the reasons I was one of the people that was kind of out on Kyren heading into the season was afraid of Blake Corum cutting into his snap share. And of course, it's week one, nothing is permanent, but it will be interesting to see if Kyren just kind of maintains that true stronghold on the backfield. And if Corum, they just view as a true backup. He's got a great matchup against the Cardinals. James Cook had a good week one against Arizona. That was only really capped because Allen scored 2 rushing touchdowns. Rams' offensive line is a little bit of a mess right now, so don't necessarily expect the rushing volume that we've seen in the past. Like we saw those games last year where they just ran with Kyren. But I think overall the Rams should be able to move the ball effectively, against Arizona. And so I think this will be a high-scoring game as well. So Kyren's set up for a good week. Number 8, James Conner. I know this is maybe a little bit ahead of consensus. This is a guy we talked about a lot in the offseason for those of you that were drafting 0 or hero RB teams to target. He had a solid week one as the workhorse back. He was involved in the receiving game, which helps his floor quite a bit. He's going up against the Rams that were just gashed on the ground by the Lions last week. So I think this is a really good setup for James Conner. And I'll say this every time I mention James Conner. If you are a Conner owner, please make sure you have Trey Benson on your rosters, because we know with Conner, he's had health concerns throughout his career just because he looked great week one. I know Benson got mixed in a little bit, but please just protect that investment and pick up Trey Benson if you haven't already. Number 9, Isaiah Pacheco had a solid week one on the ground. I would expect the Chiefs to be winning this game, and the Bengals cannot stop the run, like at all. I mean, they single-handedly lost to Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots last week because they couldn't stop him in the run. And the Patriots don't really have a good quarterback or great wide receiver, so they had to pound Stevenson. And the fact that the Bengals knew that they were pounding Stevenson and they still couldn't stop him, I think is just a green light for Pacheco this week. And I would expect them to run up the score a little bit too as well. We know the Bengals got the best of Mahomes a few years ago in the postseason, so I think there's a little bit of that revenge game and that rivalry that he has with Joe Burrow. But Burrow did not look good week one. I don't know if T. Higgins is going to be back, so I think the Chiefs will win this game handedly. Number 10, Joe Mixon had a great week one, leading all running backs with 30 touches. Texans are a 6.5 point favorite, which could lead to another positive game script where clearly he just gets fed and he's the guy that they trust. And we saw last year, one of the missing pieces of Texans, albeit they had a great year, was they just did not have a good run game. Joe Mixon's not the most explosive guy in the world. He's not the flashiest, but he's proving that, he can be an effective runner in that system. So I think with that volume, I think Mixon has a very high floor. Number 11, Jordan Mason. Obviously, this is contingent on whether or not Christian McCaffrey plays. It sounded as if earlier in the week he was not, and then he had a report that he thought he was good to go. But I would expect the 49ers to be cautious with McCaffrey. They're playing against the Vikings that, a game they should win, right? I don't think the 49ers are in jeopardy of losing this game, even though Darnold looked really good week one. That was against the Giants. So I would expect another positive game script where, they just continue to feed Mason because he really was that only guy running the ball, obviously other than Debo, but in terms of running backs on that team. Number 12, Alvin Kamara. He's got a tough matchup against the Cowboys after an easy matchup last week against the Panthers. We know the Saints' offensive line is not good. So this ranking, I think, is because Kamara is going to get a bunch of checkdowns from Derek Carr. They're not going to be able to stop Dallas up front. Carr is going to kind of panic and just dump it off to him. So in half PPR, especially in full PPR, I think Kamara is a really good play here. And last week, he actually had 4 touches inside the 10-yard line, and Taysom Hill had 0. Not saying that's going to be permanent, but I think that's a very encouraging sign because, one of the reasons Kamara fell in some drafts is people were afraid that he was going to be getting vultured at the goal line. So for now, it looks like that role is his. Number 13, Rachaad White. He had the second most receiving yards amongst RBs all week. What else is new? He was the workhorse until they were up big and Bucky Irving came in. I will say Bucky Irving does scare me a lot long term. And personally, as someone who's not a huge Rachaad White fan, just from a true running back perspective, I would be looking to sell high on White before it's too late, because Bucky looked a lot better running between the tackles, which is what we know Rachaad White's not necessarily great at. White is more of a receiving running back, but Bucky's also a very good receiving running back as well. So watch that closely if Bucky continues to eat into White's starting time. And like I said with James Conner, if you are a Rachaad White owner, try to get Bucky Irving on your team if you don't have him already. Number 14, Kenneth Walker. At this point, he's still not practicing, recording this on Friday morning. So keep an eye out for that. He's got a fairly tough matchup against the Patriots, even if he does play. Seattle is expected to win this game, but Pat's defense is always pretty solid. But Ken Walker's such a good running back and so explosive that you know he can rip off a 35-yard run at any given point. So for now, ranked number 14, but keep an eye on that injury report. Number 15, David Montgomery. Like I mentioned with Jahmyr Gibbs, heavy favorites against the Bucs in the highest expected team total of the week. So favorites in a game that they should score a lot. He was kind of the hero in overtime last week. And we know David Montgomery is one of Dan Campbell's favorite players. We know if they're up in the fourth quarter, they're just going to want Montgomery to grind out the clock. Good chance he scores a touchdown in this game as well. So I think Monty's a really good play this week. Number 16, Travis Etienne. Last week, he had only 54% of the backfield touches. So they told us throughout the offseason that Tank Bigsby was improving and they were going to continue to get him the ball more, and they were right. So it'll be interesting to watch that. I picked up Tank Bigsby on one of my teams just because if he does really cut into that workload, it's something to at least have. If you're an Etienne owner, I would definitely recommend handcuffing him with Bigsby. But Etienne did have every red zone snap over Tank Bigsby, which was encouraging. However, Etienne did have that fumble that more or less cost them the game. So I think the coach was, positive about that. It wasn't negative. Kind of talked up his guy afterwards. It happens, which I think was encouraging. But watching the film this week, they were probably pretty upset about that. So keep that in mind. Number 17, Josh Jacobs. Packers, unfortunately, are only expected to score 18 points this week, which is a product of Malik Willis likely getting the start. Jacobs is a tough one to rank because he should get a ton of volume, but I have a hard time believing this offense will be moving efficiently under Malik Willis, regardless of how many good weapons the Packers have around them. The light at the end of the tunnel is the Colts just let Joe Mixon run all over them, and LaFleur is a really good play caller. So a little bit hesitant about this ranking. I think he's still a starter just based on volume because, and he's a talented running back as well. But tough game for him here. Number 18, Ramondre Stevenson. He single-handedly won the game for the Patriots last week against the Bengals, even though he was facing stacked boxes at a very high rate. I talked about this, Cincinnati not being able to stop the run at all. I don't expect Pats to be in many positive game scripts this year, but they're only a 3-point underdog at home against the Seahawks. So I think it should be fairly close. And at this point, Ramondre is their best offensive player, so it should be running through him. Number 19, Najee Harris. It was pretty clear after week 1 that Arthur Smith favors Najee to Warren. Maybe some of that was due to Warren's injury, the nagging injury he had heading into week 1. So that kind of remains to be seen. But would not expect to have heavy pass volume with Fields under center this week. Against Denver, I would expect them to run quite a bit. Their best wide receiver, George Pickens, he's going to have to face Pat Surtain all day. So I would really expect a ground and pound approach. They're also favored in this game, which could lead to a positive game script. So I think Najee's in a really good spot this week. Number 20, Aaron Jones. Great start to his career last week with the Vikings. That was awesome to see. I'm sure Green Bay fans were not happy to see, one of their favorite players jump across to Minnesota. But this week, they've got a very tough matchup against the 49ers. Jordan Addison is out this week, so I think that offense is going to run through, obviously, Justin Jefferson, but Aaron Jones as well. Still no TJ Hawkinson. So I think, with Jones, this is more of a talent and volume play because, I would expect him to be down. But I think, Darnold can have some quick checkdowns to Aaron Jones. We've seen how explosive he is. So should be in for an okay week. All right. And with that is the top 20 running backs for week 2. If you're still with us, thank you so much for watching and look forward to seeing you in the next one.